Hello and welcome to today's screencast. The focus is on part 2 of the vascular system. So just as a quick recap on this then, when we talk about the vascular system, it is part of the cardiovascular system. So when we have the cardiovascular system, we're talking about the heart, blood and blood vessels. When we're talking about the vascular system within the cardiovascular system, we're talking about blood and blood vessels. Okay, so two parts of the vascular system, and the first one is mechanisms that help us maintain venous return. So those mechanisms, those internal physiological mechanisms that allow us to get blood back to the heart during exercise. Okay, so that's our first thing we've looked at. Second part of the vascular system is having a look at something called vascular shunts. Now this is looking at how we use our blood vessels to transport the blood to the working muscles during exercise. Okay, so the actual definition of vascular shunt is this: it's the redistribution of blood flow during exercise. Now, during exercise, we need to redistribute our blood to the muscles. Okay, we have to do that process. But before we have a look at that, let's have a look at what it might look like at rest. So if we have a look at rest, what is happening in terms of our blood flow or our cardiac output? 80% of our blood flow or cardiac output is going to the organs of the body, as you can see all the way around here. Okay, and only 20% of our blood flow or cardiac output is going to our working muscles. That's because we don't need the working muscles when we're resting. Okay, as much. We're not working, we're not moving, we're not contracting muscles, we're often sat still, for example, so we don't need all of the blood flow there. So this is at rest. Okay, what we're going to have a look at on the next slide is how this changes. In order to do that, there are certain things in the specification we have to know about. Okay, so we have to know about when we redistribute blood or cardiac output during exercise, we have to know about something called the vascular shunt mechanism, as I talked about here. We have to look at these three things here. We need to know about the role of the vasomotor center, role of arterioles, role of precapillary sphincters. If you remember what I said before, this topic, anything to do with the vascular system, about blood and blood vessels. As you can see here, we've got two vessels, some new vessels maybe, to have a look at. Okay, so let's have a look. First up then, so if we just keep this in our mind, our key note taking needs to start here really. It's good to have took notes of the first slide, but our key note taking takes here. So redistribution of blood flow during exercise, vascular shunt. So during exercise then, well, there is a redistribution of blood flow. So what happens now is it goes from what was 80% going to the organs of the body, now switches and redistributes, so we now have 80% of the blood going to the working muscles. Okay, so when we start running, when we start lifting weights, 80% of our blood is going to go to the muscles that are contracting. So it could be our quads, it could be our biceps. I'll put two examples of skeletal muscles there, talking about that process. So when we exercise, vascular shunt takes place. Vascular shunt is the redistribution of blood flow to the working muscles because we need it. Okay, so let's have a look at how we start our answer on this. So first thing is, during exercise, 80% of blood goes to our working muscles. So let's have a look then at why this happens. Why do we get 80% to the working muscles? Well, the key reason why, as I just said then, blood is redistributed to the working muscles because they need it most, and it is taken away from the organs of the body because they need it less. It's a very, very simple process, but this is the whole reason we have to be able to say why vascular shunt takes place. Why do we have this redistribution of blood flow? And once we understand that, we then need to have an understanding of how does it happen. Okay, and before we even know that, we've got to think then, right, so imagine we're sat still. Okay, 80% of our blood is going to the organs, 20% are going to our muscles. Suddenly we start running, okay, and then we redistribute our blood flow to our working muscles. 80% of that might happen. So once that has happened, so we've set it onto here, it's redistributed. What is it? What is it that detects or starts the whole process off? And the what is actually linked to receptors, as we know from previous knowledge. So what happens is when we start running, 3 receptors detect changes. Now, as we know, we have to give the name of the receptor and say what they detect. So we should know pretty much that we have chemoreceptors detect an increase in carbon dioxide, baroreceptors detect an increase in blood pressure, and proprioceptors detect an increase in movement. Now, these 3 receptors, as we would know, we need to know where are they going to send this information from. So when we consider where they're going to send the information to, we need to consider the brain, and we need to think of a specific center in the brain. Now, for the cardiac control center, when we looked at neural control, that was one place. Now what we need to know is there is a different place in our brain, very close in proximity to cardiac control center, but this one has a direct responsibility for starting vascular shunt. And this control center is called the vasomotor control center. Its responsibility is to stimulate vascular shunt. And if you want to add this, its key role is to change the vessel width. Okay, so to change the vessel or the blood vessel width. So if that is where the information is sent, once the vasomotor control center stimulates vascular shunt, we need to know how the vessels change in order to get more blood to our working muscles. So let's have a look at how that might work. How does it happen then? Well, it happens via blood vessels which open and close. So what this is the basic terminology. Obviously, because we are doing an A-level, we need to have an understanding of what blood vessels we are talking about, okay, and what the new words are for open and close. So I think these are really good kind of trigger questions for your Cornell notes, because how vascular shunt takes place is the main part of this whole topic. So let's have a look then. First things first, we have a vessel action called vasodilation. So vasodilation is when the blood vessels open. Okay, so if you imagine a circular blood vessel, okay, they open up. Okay, so they dilate. Your pupils dilate, they get wider. Okay, so dilation means the widening of blood vessels. And there are two specific blood vessels we need. Those blood vessels are called arterioles and precapillary sphincters. So arterioles are a smaller version of arteries, and precapillary sphincters are just before the capillaries, which we'll have a look at in lesson. And they open when they're supplying the muscles. So that makes sense. Suddenly we've had all of this process taking place, but actually in order to get 80% of our blood to the working muscles, the vessels that are carrying the blood, arterioles and precapillary sphincters, they need to open, they need to widen, they need to dilate, but we have to call it vasodilate. So there's a vasodilation of the arterioles and precapillary sphincters supplying the working muscles, and in contrast to that, during exercise, the opposite action happens to the same vessels supplying the non-essential organs. So this time there is vasoconstriction of the arterioles and precapillary sphincters supplying the organs that don't need it. Because if we can then shut or close or narrow those blood vessels, the arterioles and precapillary sphincters supplying the organs, this helps us only take or push 20% of the blood there, which is what we need during exercise, because we only need 20% there. So we close it, open the vessels, vasodilate, arterioles and precapillary sphincters supplying the working muscles. That allows more blood, 80% of it, to get to our working muscles. Okay, so that is our key section there. Hopefully you've got that down. This is the key bit you're going to need. I think the first slide is good just to get an understanding of what the rest ratios or percentages of blood flow are. Okay, make good notes. Thanks very much.